Welcome to the Blue Light Diaries, the podcast that sheds light on the stories from the real people behind the uniform, both past and present, who are the body and soul of the emergency services. This is an open and honest space to talk about the unspoken. We'll go into the challenges and the problems faced whilst working in the emergency services, as well as sharing our successes and our secrets too. Whether it's the impact on life outside the services or dealing with situations at work, this is the place for all to share safely. And I'm Sharon Williams, your podcast host, ex-police detective, and now a counsellor and psychotherapist, who will be with you along the way to make sure everyone has a voice in this emergency services space. And with that, let's get on with the show. Today's title is PTSD and how it's destroying the police force. I'm going to look at how this is happening, why it's happening, and look at ways that you can manage PTSD as a serving or retired officer. So what is PTSD and CPTSD? So PTSD stands for post-traumatic stress disorder, and the C comes about when it's in its complex form. Complex post-traumatic stress disorder. When I say PTSD, it will refer to complex PTSD as well, unless I say otherwise, just for your information. So PTSD is caused by exposure to traumatic events, such as violent crimes, road traffic collisions, or any form of disaster, especially in the emergency services. Police officers are far more likely to develop PTSD than any other member of the public. Research done in the UK suggests that police officers in particular are up to 5 times more likely to develop PTSD. Police officers are exposed to way more potentially traumatic events than any of the general population. As an example, a police officer may attend 400 to 600 traumatic events during their career, whilst most members of the public experience, on average, 3 to 4 traumatic events during their entire lifetime. That's incredible. And now you can see how you are far more vulnerable at developing symptoms of mental health disorders than the general population. And this is why we have to look at how to look after ourselves. And this is also what is destroying the police service. So let's take a look at some important areas. We need to look at the impact on officers and supporting staff. There's mental health decline, an increase in anxiety and stress and depression, and quite possibly unhealthy coping mechanisms going on, some of which we might be aware of, others which we might not. Our physical health is being affected too. Chronic pain, cardiovascular issues, sleep deprivation are all contributory factors to symptoms of PTSD. There's an impact on performance. We see decreased productivity and effectiveness, increased absence and increased turnover of staff. There's a strain on resources. There's more sick leave than there ever has been. There's a need for cover, for replacements for officers that are on sick, but there aren't any. So those people are forced to continue working. And there must be a public safety concern here, such as impaired decision-making and reduced engagement with members of the public. There is, of course, the organisational culture, the stigma around mental health issues leading to underreporting, unacknowledged and untreated conditions, and that's physical conditions and mental health conditions. There's a lack of support systems and a lack of early measures to put things in place, leading to underreporting, unacknowledged and untreated conditions, and that's physical conditions and mental health conditions. There's a lack of support systems and early measures to address the early stages of any mental health condition. Officers tend to collect things up as they go about their day, and the days turn into weeks, and the weeks turn into months, and before you know it, a year has gone by. And when I say we collect things up, I mean, even in your first year of service, we go and see so many different walks of life. We deal with so many different incidents, some that turn out to be more urgent than we anticipated, which have us thinking on our feet, and others that stay with us for the rest of our lives. And of course, there is the mundane, run-of-the-mill, basic job that we all have been to. But at any time, those basic jobs can turn into something major. Imagine living with that anticipation every single day of your life. When I was a serving police officer, I would consciously be carrying around a lot on my shoulders, and I would describe it similar to carrying a sack on my shoulder. And every traumatic, emotional, upsetting job that I went to, I popped in this sack and carried it over my shoulder, which is relatively easy to start with. But then the jobs start getting harder. They start becoming more distressing. You're going to more stuff. And then you find yourself going to jobs on your own, potentially putting your life at risk every single day. That adds to that sack that you're carrying on your back. And before you know it, that year's gone past and that sack is feeling heavy. That's a lot to carry. And for people that have been serving 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, those that have done their 30 years or 35 years now, that sack is unbearable. That sack of stuff on your back is unbearable. There are more police officers being medically retired from the job now than there ever has been, and it's only going to get worse. That is not fair on the officer who needs help and support, not more challenges thrown at them. The average length of service is also reducing. I know of several officers that have done 3 years, 5 years, 7 years, and their eyes have been opened to the lack of support and where budget cuts are affecting the people on the streets, the officers that are facing frontline, and everybody else for that matter. It's not just the uniform cops, it's everybody. There's a knock-on effect. But they're seeing this truth and they're thinking, nah, it's not for me. Fuck that, I'm off. And they're very sensibly removing themselves, and they go on to have very successful, happy careers and happy lives as a result of that. But it's not something that's made 100% certainly clear when you're applying for the job. It's not something that you are offered 100% backup, 100% support when you're experiencing it. You are always there for the job, but when the shit hits the fan and you start getting symptoms of a mental health condition, albeit light symptoms, early days, I'm getting the odd flashback here and there and I'm not sleeping as well as I was, but I can manage. People don't talk out about that, and that is the prime time to nip this in the bud and unpack that sack full of shit that you've been carrying around with you in a way that it won't come back to haunt you later. But the police service don't recognise this. They're not proactive in mental health support and well-being support. They talk a good show, but it doesn't happen. It didn't happen when I went through the process, and it's certainly not happening now. PTSD is one of the highest reasons that police officers are being medically retired in the UK. And that speaks volumes. So we can see how it's destroying the police service. And with the lack of help from the police service, this is why it's essential that we educate ourselves to recognise the signs and the symptoms so we can take positive action fast, to lay down some of that shit that we've been carrying around, even over a short space of time. And we need to be able to avoid burnout and breakdown. So how can you identify and manage PTSD? In brief terms, there are 3 different types of trauma, and I would like to explain these to you so we know what kind of situations are affecting us. It's not just the bad jobs we go to. So the first type of trauma is known as direct trauma. This is trauma that's been experienced firsthand. such as being in a serious accident, being assaulted, or being involved in a natural disaster. This is stuff that we've been to as cops, jobs that we've attended. The signs and symptoms, briefly, of direct trauma can be flashbacks, hypervigilance, and intrusive thoughts. Now, they're not something that we can control happening, but we can control how we respond to them, and ignoring them is not going to make them go away. It only makes it worse. So the second type of trauma is secondary trauma or vicarious trauma. And this is trauma that's being experienced indirectly. So you're being exposed to the traumatic experiences of others, often those in caring professions, like counsellors or police officers. I myself am exposed to vicarious trauma on a daily basis. And in order to help me process that, I have monthly supervision with a trained counsellor and supervisor who is there to make sure that I am okay with the workload that I've got on and that I am coping okay with listening to other people's trauma. So in my role as a police officer, I experience the direct trauma. In my role now as a counsellor and psychotherapist, I experience vicarious trauma. And signs and symptoms of this vicarious or secondary trauma include emotional exhaustion, feeling numb, changes in the worldview, or in a sense of safety. Now, I've never felt unsafe. My worldview changed when I joined the police, as it probably has done with many of you. And the emotional exhaustion is a thing. This is why I only limit myself to a certain amount of clients at any one time. And this is why we have boundaries in place to protect me and to protect you as the client. And the third type of trauma is known as developmental trauma. This is trauma experienced in early childhood, often due to abuse or neglect or any other adverse experiences during the critical development periods of your life. The signs and symptoms of this developmental trauma can show up as difficulty in forming relationships and maintaining those relationships, emotional dysregulation, and trust issues. Now, those three different types of trauma anybody can be exposed to, but where we as police officers are exposed to more is the direct trauma and the vicarious trauma. Now, if you have developmental trauma thrown in there as well, that's a lot of trauma for one individual to be dealing with. This is why we need to highlight the importance of taking early support and help. Early intervention will help this going from PTSD to CPTSD to burnout to breakdown. And that's hard to come back from. And that's why I'm here to help people that have been through this and are going through this. Those people who have been absolutely fine one moment, and the next moment something can happen in their life, their own personal life, that triggers this whole sack of shit that they've been carrying over their shoulder for years to come overflowing. It's dumped down right in front of them, and there's nothing you can do other than face it. And that's not a comfortable place to be in. Identification is a basic policing tool. You do it every day. Identifying suspects, identifying offences, identifying the signs of mental unwellness. That last one we're not so good at. PTSD symptoms can sneak up on you. There may be things such as intrusive thoughts. And these intrusive thoughts aren't just around suicide and suicidality or suicidal ideation. Intrusive thoughts can be the flashbacks, the nightmares, and the distressing memories that all of your senses can recall when you're trying to put your head down on the pillow at night to go to sleep. And all of a sudden you can hear stuff from that traumatic incident you've been to. You can smell it. You can feel it. You get the cold shudder run down your spine and you're back there. Avoidance is another symptom. So you may find yourself avoiding shouting up for jobs on the radio or avoiding work altogether, just not going in. You're off sick. Ask yourself, am I really unwell, or am I avoiding facing the reality? With avoidance, people will tend to steer clear of any reminders of the trauma whatsoever, and they will avoid certain people or places or activities because it reactivates or triggers those painful memories. You may have negative changes in your mood or your cognition. You might have persistent negative emotions, distorted feelings of guilt and shame. You may even have difficulty remembering aspects of the traumatic event itself. And this sometimes flags up in statement writing when you've been to a traumatic job and you are trying to recall the detail, but you can't. That's the brain's way of protecting you. Sometimes it could be better to write that statement when you've had time to come back down again from that traumatic event that you've just been to. But that's not always the case. I know that as well as the next person. You might experience changes in your arousal and reactivity. And I'm talking about hypervigilance here. You are on guard 24/7, no matter whether you are at work or at home. You're just out for a walk in the park with the dog. You've gone out for a coffee with the partner. You are on high alert, waiting for that trouble. You could be feeling on edge and tense. You could be easily startled by something. You could have outbursts of anger, which are way over the top. And you could have difficulty sleeping. Now, we know that sleep deprivation is a form of torture for a reason. It makes things even harder to deal with. It's not that you can't cope, it's probably a lack of sleep that's contributing to the difficulty of facing this. So, complex PTSD arises from prolonged or repeated trauma, particularly in situations where escape is difficult. Some additional symptoms for complex PTSD may include emotional dysregulation. Now, by that, I mean you may have severe difficulty in managing your emotions. You may not even feel anything. You may feel completely numb. You may be unable to identify those emotions. You might be experiencing persistent sadness. You may be having suicidal thoughts, and explosive anger is another symptom of complex PTSD. You may have a negative self-perception, feeling worthless, feeling helpless, deep-seated feelings of guilt and shame. You may be experiencing interpersonal difficulties, such as challenges in forming and maintaining relationships. You may be avoiding intimacy. You may be feeling detached from other people. There are also some physical symptoms: chronic pain, persistent headaches, muscle tension, and gastro issues. They say that the gut is the second brain, and we need to listen to that. So if some of those symptoms are something that you have been experiencing or you have noticed in somebody else, talk about them. Early detection and intervention is essential to prevent the worsening of these symptoms. And early detection also leads to much better outcomes. PTSD is hard to recover from. Complex PTSD can be even harder and take even longer. All the more reason for early intervention. So if you suspect or you detect the early signs of your mental health decline or that of somebody else's, if you think you may be experiencing symptoms, get some help with your well-being. To enable us to be able to manage this and to move forward with a more positive opinion on mental health, we need to talk about this. If we are to manage this effectively and prevent it getting any worse, don't ignore it. I always say that it's not a sign of weakness to talk about your mental health, but ignoring it absolutely is. We need to get better at things like peer support or have welfare officers that have been specially trained to provide support in all areas of mental well-being. For the tutorship of new officers, mental health awareness should be made a mandatory part of the new officer training and be reinforced by tutors in specialist areas. For example, on road traffic units, those attending fatals on a daily basis, they need to have some extra well-being support in place. The shift skipper should be way more proactive in their approach to recognising the signs and symptoms and taking mental health seriously. They should be approachable and not mock officers. I strongly believe the police service has an absolute responsibility to provide appropriate support for police and police staff and PCSOs and special constables. And that does not come in the form of employee assistance programs. Wellness education training programs and access to counselling is what should be provided, and a culture where this is totally acceptable. I recently watched the first episode of a ITV drama called Platform 7, and it surrounds the suicide of a few people. But in this particular scene, there was a gentleman that had jumped in front of a train, and the transport police were on scene. There was a new, seemingly younger police officer there, and he was handed some evidence bags and said, "Is this your first time, lad? Pick up the large bits first. Don't worry, we all have to do it. There's counselling if you need it, all right." And then that older officer jumped down onto the train line and began executing his duties, as we have sadly had to do ourselves at some point. And kudos to the researchers on that programme, because that is just how it is. There's counselling if you need it. There's no shame in it. But there is, because of that stigma. And it should be the officer themselves that decides who their counselling is with. They should have options for completely independent therapy, not with restrictions that gives them 6 sessions and then you're expected to be right as rain, ready to go back out on duty. And other restrictions, such as if that officer wanted to continue working with that therapist for the longer term, after their initial funded sessions, they should be able to do that. But that's not an option, because the EAP companies are run as a business, and they would lose out if every client stayed with their affiliate counsellor after their 6 or 10 sessions that's paid for by their employer. I have had counselling myself for my own PTSD, and I still live with some of the symptoms to this day. It's how I deal with them nowadays that's important. I'm not just chucking all of the shit that I go through into that sack of shit that I'm carrying around over my shoulder. I'm talking about it. I'm sitting with it. I'm feeling the emotions and feeling the pain, even though it's uncomfortable, it's heavy and it hurts. But that allows me to process those emotions and pack it away so I can move forward without that dragging me down. There are very few officers out there that will complete their now 35 years, or ones that have retired already, that won't have something come back and haunt them from their days in the job. That's a sad fact. But what support do retired officers get from the police service? Absolutely none. I was medically retired and didn't have any resettlement courses. I wasn't offered any therapy. Nobody's been in touch with me to see how I'm doing. Not that I want them to, but if we care about people and our officers and their well-being, and we will do everything we can to support them, where's the interest? It's disingenuous. Think about this. So you regularly take your car or cars to the garage for a service to make sure that they're running on tip-top condition. And we've all had that moment where we've heard that knocking noise and we've thought, oh shit, this is going to be expensive, but I can't deal with it till payday. Just hang on 2 more weeks. And that knocking gets louder and louder. Sometimes it ends up in the car breaking down and costing you even more money. Sometimes you make it to payday and you're able to get through by the skin of your teeth. We don't take ourselves for a service. So why do we put more effort into making sure our car runs smoothly than we do ourselves? And I'd like to say the equivalent of taking your car for a service in terms of your mental well-being would be to have a therapist. But I would say that, wouldn't I? It's true, that's why. I have been in your shoes. I know exactly how it feels to realize, shit, things are going downhill. I'm losing it. I need help. I know what it feels like to feel vulnerable, to need looking after when you're the one that looks after everybody. It's shit. But a majority of people in America have a therapist like we have a dentist or a doctor. They treat therapy as important as they treat their dental hygiene and their physical health. Their mental health and their mental well-being is just as important. Why don't we do that? We're proactive by nature as cops. Well, most of us are. But when it comes to mental health, we are reactive. And we all know that reactive work, you're fighting harder, you're firefighting. If we're proactive about stuff and we can prepare for its onset, we can stop it in its tracks and stop that knocking noise from getting even worse and costing us an absolute fortune. And I'm not talking about money. I'm talking about time, which is the most precious commodity any of us have on this planet. You never get it back. So isn't it time you took your health seriously? After all, you make sure your car's okay. What's more important to you? There are a few of us out here now that are ex-cops, and we are dedicating our new roles to helping people like you. There are people that you can see for therapy, completely unattached to the job, completely independent and unrestricted like me. There are people that will come into your work and train you and your colleagues and your superiors into better looking after your well-being and your mental health. And there are plenty of people out there to keep you physically fit and focused. Some of them are still serving in the role. Some of them have left, but they are all focusing on you and your well-being and making the best of the life that you have. Start using us. Start shouting about us. Follow us on social media. Tell your sergeants about us. Tell the rest of your team about us. Recognizing the signs, seeking the support, and ensuring that you're investing in yourself is essential to maintain this lifestyle and this job. So I would love to hear what you think about PTSD and complex PTSD, whether you've had any experience of this yourself or you know anybody that has, and especially any of your own experiences around this area, good or bad. We all know that there's conventional treatments like CBT and EMDR, etc., but this is not appropriate treatment for multiple trauma exposure. Talking to somebody that has the closest lived experience to you, i.e. me, will be the biggest benefit you could receive. Make smart choices. There are other therapy options out there, one of which is brain working recursive therapy, which I had as a client going through the retirement process, and I'm now qualified to deliver that as a therapy option in my practice, Blue Light Counselling. BWRT, as it's abbreviated to, is used on a daily basis by the South African Police Service. Now, the South African cops see some awfully traumatic stuff, torture, multiple murders. It's relentless on a daily basis. They use BWRT on their officers who can process stuff, recover from it, reset, and get back on duty. There are fast, effective, and long-lasting results with this treatment. So give it a look. There's a page on my website, bluelightcounselling.co.uk. So let's start making some smart choices and looking after ourselves more than we look after our family car. Don't let that collection of sack of shit on your back snowball, because it could be really expensive. Consider the bigger picture and always put yourself first. You are not going to get a pat on the back for going to work feeling like this. You are not going to get any extra pay for putting up with these symptoms. Encourage talking, encourage listening, and ask people how they are. Twice, be proactive. Use all the resources available to you for symptom checking, self-care, and support each other. There is so much strength and support to be found in your peers and your family and your friends. Shout about the importance of seeking support. Don't carry all of this shit on your shoulders on your own. Allow us to help you process it and pack it away so it's much less likely to resurface in the future. Share this podcast, share it amongst your friends, your family, your network, your colleagues from all the emergency services. There's huge progress to be made here, and this is just the start. I need your help. Seeking help is not a sign of weakness, but ignoring it is. When you're ready to talk, I'm here to listen. Until next time, take care out there.